With their truck and their supplies, Lee continued their journey towards north in hopes of finding Wellington. Truth be told, he had no idea where he would begin looking once they made in that direction north. But it was certain that if Wellington was real, they had taken in survivors. They would surely leave hints around to point them in the right direction. While he had been driving for quite some time now, the sun was closely to disappearing, and into the thick clouds, and nighttime he could surely follow. He was beginning to feel tired, and wanted to pull over for a while, but he did not want to do that for many reasons. It was cold, walkers could get them, or worse, bandits could raid them and take everything. But if he continued driving any longer, he would surely fall asleep. He kept his eyes glued to the windows for any sign of shelter they could stay for the night. But it was hard to see with the entire snowstorm. He continued doing so for a short while, in his hopes to have lifted up, when he found and saw something that looked like a large garage in the middle of nowhere. It would keep them safe and warm. Carefully, he turned off the main road and approached the garage, hope it wasn't infested with walkers or people. He parked the car just outside and slowly got out of the truck, leaving the two girls and the baby alone for a couple minutes. Lee took his Glock 17 out and marched towards the garage and pressed his feet onto the cold, and the snowflakes landed upon his head and shoulders. He leaned down and placed his hand upon the garage. With one good pull, he lifted the garage door up and immediately aimed his weapon for any sign of danger. Fortunately, it was empty, dirty but empty. It was a little difficult to see inside the garage, since dusk was slowly approaching, and now he was certain it was safe. Lee got back into the truck and reversed inside. He got back in the truck for the second time, closed the garage door from the inside, leaving them in quite a bit of darkness. The only light they had left was the sun shining through the small window. When it came to dark, they would be buried in darkness. I better get some rest, Lee talked to himself. He did on most occasions. He got back into the truck and turned off the engine, followed by locking the door, just an extra precaution. He slowly towards Clementine for a moment, who was sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, while holding AJ in her arms. As for Sarah, she was still sleeping too, lying down in the back seat. Lee then turned around and faced forward at the windscreen. He slowly closed his eyes, and had not had some decent sleep in a while, and his body practically crying out for sleep. He could not hold it any further. Eventually his eyes closed, and his head tilted to the side, drifting off to a deep sleep. Lee panicked while he was searching around the woods in Carolina for the source of yells. He, Carly, and Clementine had been wandering around the area for search for supplies till they heard someone screaming for crying out for help. "Where are you?" Lee called out, searching for the same direction of any sign of life, not to knowing where it was coming from exactly. "Where are you?" "Help me!" The same voice called out for the second time. "Over there!" Carly pointed out in the direction of yelling. And quick as a flash, Lee practically sprinted over towards his girlfriend and pointed over a log like an athlete. He then came across into contact with the man, who was screaming and horrified to see he was too late. The man was currently fighting off a walker with his bare hands, but regardless if Lee killed it or not, the man had a huge bite mark on his shoulder. It was too late. Without saying a word, Lee had raised his rifle with a good aim. He fired and hit the walker directly on the side of its head. He lowered his gun down slowly and could only watch in shock as the walker collapsed down onto its back. Now he merely stood there, but before long, Carly and Clementine eventually caught up to him and stood beside them as they watched the man slowly dying in agony. It was best to put him out of his misery right there. Lee beckoned the two to stay where they were as he slowly walked towards with the man, with his rifle lowered to his side. He lowered his head with sympathy with a sad expression across his face, feeling guilty for not being able to save a life. "I'm sorry." Despite the man practically at the verge of death at this point, he looked up towards Lee with a normal expression across his face. He looked around in his middle 30s and had blue eyes and wore glasses. He wore a red and green checkered t-shirt with blue jeans. He looked like a Caucasian American. He held his hand where he had been bitten, and merely watched as the stranger raised his gun up to finish him. "Wait!" Lee did not want him to suffer any longer. but it was not right to kill someone unless they were today. But without hearing the last words for starters. I know I'm going to die, the man admitted. His face grew with fear. He groaned and blood smeared across his hand, but he had to finish before he died. You have to go to north, to Ohio, near Michigan. North? Carly repeated, was that she and Clementine just stood beside Lee, despite his wishes for them to stay where they were just in case. Ohio? Clementine was the second to repeat what she just said. She crossed her arms together. What's north? Lee inquired, in somewhat of a puzzle on it what he just said. Wellington, the man answered, leaving the trio puzzled at what he just said. It's a safe place. A fortress. Food, water, and shelter. You get there, you'll be safe. Safe. With that last word, the man had died from blood loss and the infection and just fell down to his side. Lee had the opportunity to make sure the stranger did not become one of them. Without saying a word, Lee swamped his rifle for Carly's pistol, fired a single round to the man's head. The gunshot echoed through the air and scared off a few crows nearby. Let's go, Lee told them, before he turned around and proceeded down the path. He and Carly swapped guns again. Along the way, he continued walking through the Carolina woods. As they were moving, Lee could not help but wonder about this destination with the man just informed them about. Could it be real? Could it be just a place where he and Carly would settle down peacefully? A place where they could raise Clementine properly? A place where they would have to not use a weapon again? It sounded like a dream come true. They should take their chances to try and find it. They had nowhere else to go, and Ohio was not as far as they thought. He had to try. He first decided to try and find the map somewhere again, and then he would ask Clementine and Carly on what they thought. If they had agreed, the three of them could make it there and leave in one piece like everything was normal again. He had to try. He had to. Lee gasped slightly as his eyes widened open. He turned towards the sound of the voice to see his adoptive daughter, who held AJ in her arms. Was that she rubbed her eye with one. He realized it was all just a dream, or better yet, a flashback. He shook off his dream and shifted his attention towards Clementine. Oh, hey, Clem, did you sleep all right? I won't lie, I prefer a bed, Clementine admitted, with a slight smile across her face. It even meant Lee smiled at her for humor. Lee chuckled in response, relieved to see that she had not almost lost all childlike innocence. Me too, sweet pea. Clementine's smile in response was that they took the chance to study their surroundings, to see that she was still in the back of the truck, but now in the dark environment, only with a bit of light. Where are we anyway? I had to stop for the night to find this empty garage. I figured we better sleep in and keep the cold out, Lee answered. As he pressed the button that unlocked all of the locks to the car, he got out of the truck and proceeded to go over towards the garage door. He found it difficult to handle with all the darkness, but at the end, he found it with this grip and lifted up. The light shot inside the garage the moment it was open, lightly blinding Lee and Clementine outside. They could see a couple of walkers limping towards the road, the way they had come from, but they seemed to be unaware of all three humans nearby. Lee did not plan to stick around and wait for their friends to show up. Lee got back to the truck and placed the keys onto the ignition. He turned them in the right direction, but the engine merely rattled in response. Not again, he mumbled, turning them on again in an attempt to start the engine, but it refused to start. He constantly began turning the keys clockwise and counterclockwise, but it still refused to start. Come on! Clementine set the baby onto her lap for a moment and leaned forward without Lee noticing, curled her hand into a fist. She jammed it hard against the dashboard and leaned it back into a seat, placing AJ into her arms. Lee was about to say something, but his eyes drifted back to when the engine started. He looked like Clementine's hit against the dashboard did the job. Nice job, Lee praised as he shifted the gear stick into the right gear and slowly drove out of the garage. It was going well so far, but the car was fully out of the garage, and Lee had panicked along the way, learned how the windows on the side, as much as he could hear something bang against the window from the outside. He quickly drove away before Walker had the chance to actually actually broke in, but of course, to get to them in the roam. Jesus, Lee quietly gasped and turned towards back the way they came, but the snowstorm made it difficult to see the walkers in the distance. He turned back towards the widescreen and paid close attention to avoid crashing into anything, especially in this weather. On the bright side, they seemed to be up early, which gave them plenty of time to try and make some good distances, and the snowstorm was not looking as bad as it did yesterday. It was still hard to make things out in the distance, but at least for now he could still see where they were going. As they were driving, Lee turned towards Clementine just for a second and saw her marching inside the glove department, whereas she held AJ in one arm. "What are you doing?" "Searching," Clementine answered. It was obvious that Lee rolled his eyes in response. His expression changed to slightly happy when she found something useful. Took it out of the glove department. "Hey Lee, I found a map. Could tell us where we are." "Nice going, Clem," Lee praised. Used one of his hands to accept the map and the other placed on the dashboard when he could not open it while he was driving. Clem was busy with the baby. Clementine was not done searching inside the glove department. She pulled out a small CD box in the front cover called The Rolling Stones. "My dad loved this band. He used to always sing one of at least their songs when he was happy." "Rolling Stones is a classic band, Clem. I myself am a fan of them," Lee replied, with a slight grin across his face. He thought back to one of the songs he had listened to so many times that he knew the lyrics perfectly. Before long, Lee found himself singing to that one song he sang. He bobbed his head side to side like the song was actually playing. As he continued to sing himself, Clementine knew this song already and listening to her dad, trying to be like him every day, and began singing along. After all, it was going to be a while until they reached Wellington, and they may as well make the best of it. "Who's singing?" Lee and Clementine halted their singing, turned their attention towards the back seat. Sarah had just woken up. The teenage girl leaned up against the back seat and sat in the middle while she rubbed her hands against her eyes. She searched her eyes around for a moment until she found her glasses, placed them back over her eyes. "Morning, Sarah," Lee greeted. In a friendly tone, he turned his attention back towards the road. "How did you sleep?" Clementine inquired. "I never slept in a car before," Sarah responded, followed by a yawn as she stretched out her arms as far as they go. She then took out of her window in the morning sky, even though through a snowstorm. "Are we there yet?" "Not yet, Sarah," Lee replied, his eyes practically still glued to the windscreen. "Lee, can I have something to eat?" Sarah requested, feeling her stomach growl slightly. In the past, she would have to ask her father for permission for food, but she was unsure if Lee was the same. "Sure, honey. Help yourself to a breakfast bar," Lee granted. He too felt like he could have something better to eat, yet something to drink. "And while you're at it, get me and Clem one." "Sure," Sarah replied. She was searching her hands inside the duffel bags for the correct food. She eventually found some breakfast bars and handed the two over to Clementine and Lee, since he was driving and she didn't want to disturb him. Clementine accepted both bars and opened the first one for Lee, since his hands were full right now. She then placed them over the breakfast and he ate it with one hand, with it using the other one to drive. The three of them remained silent as they chewed down on their breakfast. The breakfast bars were not as good as a full breakfast of bacon, eggs, and toast, but it was as long as it was food that filled their stomachs, then it would be good enough for them. After finishing their breakfast, Clementine took the chance to check outside one of their maps. She leaned over the seat, carefully handing AJ over to Sarah, before checking on the map to see where they were. She assumed they were on the main highway that led to Straight, Ohio. "Looks like we have a few miles to go before we find any sign of land." "Doesn't sound too bad," Lee admitted, looking at the bright eyes for their quest for shelter. "Maybe when we can—" "Look out!" Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs. Took Lee a couple seconds to see that it was a clear view of a horde of walkers running straight towards them. How Sarah saw them before was a mystery. He slammed his foot against the brakes of the car and agreed to a halt, almost sending one of them flying since one of them did not have their seatbelts on. Multiple walkers were about good 30 feet ahead, were roaming around in random directions until they spotted the truck and began making their way towards them. It looked like there were at least a couple 40 of them. Too many to take it for them. And this weather, there could be entire more of them. Maybe hundreds of them. Lee was in too much shock to say anything, could only watch as the walkers advanced towards them. He turned towards Clementine's window and could just make out something in the distance. It looked like a small building, a possible rest stop. Staying in this truck was no option, and that was their best bet. "Girls out," Lee ordered. He immediately got out on his end. Clementine did not hesitate to get out of the truck into the freezing cold, but Sarah remained seated. She just sat there, her eyes glued to the window. She was in so much shock to move. Clementine opened up the back door to Sarah's side. Whistled. Lee opens it on the other side, got both bags out. She did not look forward to smacking Sarah again. Instead, she merely shook her shoulder. "Sarah, the walkers are coming. We have to protect AJ." By now, AJ was awake, but he did not look like he was crying. He merely just stared at the teenage girl. Returned the stare. Sarah dazed out from her thoughts and stepped out of the truck. Whistled held AJ in her arms. Lee took out his Glock 17 and checked the ammunition and was that the walkers were getting up on them. He did not have much bullets to take them down, even with the help of Clementine. "Clementine, I got 2 clips left. How many you got?" "1 clip," Clementine responded as she took a couple of steps backwards. She hoped Lee had an idea because she, for one, did not know what to do. "Lee, what are we going to do? They're coming." Lee had no idea how he was going to get out of this one, but his first priority is to keep Clementine, Sarah, and AJ safe. Without saying a word, he handed a lighter bag they found at the half-built to Clementine and kneeled down to her height. "Clementine, Sarah, you both take care of AJ and just keep heading in that direction." The duo followed where he was pointing, but they could just make out about where he was pointing at. "There's a building there. Go, and do not wait for me no matter what," Lee told them in a firm voice. He was unsure if he was going to come back from this one, but he promised to keep Clementine, Sarah, and AJ safe, and that was something he was going to do. Clementine had a couple tears in her eyes, not wanting Lee to leave them. After all they had been through, he was their only family left now. "Lee, no! Come with us!" "I can't, Clementine. They'll only follow," Lee explained. He placed his hands upon her shoulders and looked straight into her golden eyes. He hated to see her cry, but this was the best he had to do to keep her safe. "You both run now. Don't look back. Just run. I promise I'll be right behind you." Clementine was unsure if she could believe in his promise, but before long, he embraced Lee in a tight hug. With it, the walkers were getting closer and closer by the second. She whispered to him as she closed her eyes, pretending the walkers were not even there. "Lee, I love you." "I love you too, Clementine," Lee responded, shredding a slight tear from his eyes when he found that it would be the last time they would ever saw each other. He turned the hug for a few more seconds, until it was time for them to go. "Now both of you go. Protect AJ no matter what." Clementine merely nodded her head in agreement, despite not wanting to leave him like this. She picked up the bag and ran up the snowy hill. Sarah slowly following her closely. With it, she had AJ tight in her arms to protect him. The two of them ran up in the storm and hoped to lose walkers along the way. The second they were out of sight, Lee was officially alone. He placed his duffel bag onto the ground as he took out his Glock 17 and fired towards the closest ones. He was relieved to see not many walkers were paying any attention to Clementine and Sarah. They didn't even see them running up there, or they were just more interested in the man standing before them. Lee emptied out his last clip on the walkers, thinned out their numbers just a little bit, but more of them were soon to come. He was about to continue firing attack, but when he reloaded his last clip, he stood there in silence and stared for a moment. This was the exact person responsible for robbing the life of his loved one. How long could he have do these? How long would it have taken to kill these monsters on how to use people? Without saying a word, Lee placed his Glock 17 into his back pocket. He leaned back towards for the moment, took out another weapon he brought with him, a hatchet. The same hatchet that Luke had gave Clementine during their escape from Howe's Hardware. Lee clutched the hatchet tightly on his grip and turned to face the walkers, his face full of anger. And for the first time in ever, he showed no fear to the walkers, began to march towards them. These were the monsters that cost him everything ever he loved: his parents, his brother, Carly, many others. He had finally had enough running away from them in fear. The walkers roamed and groaned with blood dripping from their mouths as they moved towards their next victim for the day. Lee growled almost as bad as the walkers did and moved in front of them, slamming his hatchet to the closest one that came in contact with. Lee pushed back a few walkers that tried to move in and tried to get him to punch him a couple times. But even though the fact that it would not bother him, he raised his hatchet high in the air and stabbed the next walker directly in its forehead. He pushed it down, knocking a couple of others out of its way as it fell down. Lee was so focused on killing the walkers that he was unaware that he was moved between them. He was now trapped in the horde, but he was not going to stab him. A walker had just jumped towards him, attempting to bite his arm, which it succeeded in doing. It only lasted a second when Lee killed him with one hit of his hatchet. Lee turned to see his arm for a second. Could now this confirm Jane was right. The leather jacket had prevented him from biting through it. He owed her one, but he was less than likely to ever see her again. Lee was in full of anger and hell, and it would not be satisfied until each and every one of them were dead. He kicked another walker back in an attempt to knock him down, and one hit from his hatchet sent the walker flat down against the snow. He swiftly turned around when another walker tried to sneak up on him, but he had saw this and decapitated half of its head off. He pushed away the walker as it got too close, killed nearest ones that would strong hit. One more walker was unfortunately enough to try and attack this lone wolf. Lee grabbed another of Jane's advice, kicked the walker directly in its knee, sending it collapsing flat down to the ground. Without knowing that he did it, Lee stomped his foot against the walker's head, crushed its entire skull. Lee was feeling quite exhausted after killing for at least 20 walkers, and he was not going to stop yet. He had one priority left. In this world was to protect Clementine, Sarah, and AJ no matter what. He loved them like if they were his own family, and would do anything to protect them, even if it meant giving up his own life for them. The many walkers gathered around Lee, but he continued to fight for survival no matter what. He continued to repeat the same tactic over and over again, killing the nearest walker with his hatchet, and then pushing it or kicking it closest ones away. He would not let them win. He refused to let them win. Lee had slain at least half of the walkers present, and continued to fight him off of his strength. He screamed out a battle cry at the top of his lungs, soon fighting off many walkers. He had blood falling onto his clothes, but he did not care one bit. After all, surviving in this world for 2 years now, this was the last stand against the walkers. Sarah and Clementine did not look back as they continued running through the snowstorm, and that ended up blinding their vision slightly. But they could see a small building slight as they were beginning to feel weak from the cold. But if they stayed, they would eventually die from exhaustion and hypothermia. They had to get to safety. After a few more exhausting moments, Clementine and Sarah came across a small playground just outside of the building. They pushed it past and finally, they made it into the building that was called Woodchuck Rest Area, according to the sign on the wall. The two walked inside and closed the glass door behind them and keep out as much cold as possible. Now that they were there, Clementine and Sarah sat down against the wall, now unsure of what they were going to do. If they stayed there, the walkers could find them and possibly run out of food. If Lee hadn't returned, they needed to leave. They would be stranded in the middle of nowhere in the cold. There was nothing they could do. "Clementine?" Sarah spoke up, with it holding AJ in her arms. The young baby was sleeping peacefully, despite the cold weather. Is Lee coming back?" The question Clementine could not answer. She had her legs tucked up near her chest, and her arms placed around her legs. She was unsure what to say. Clementine nearly just sat there now with tears slightly dripping down her neck. She did not want to lose him. Sarah, too, was scared for Lee. She liked Lee as a friend and a father figure, and with him gone, she felt that she could not protect herself. She and Clementine, of course, but Sarah was older than her and could just take care of herself. Clementine may act like an adult, but it doesn't mean she is one. A few minutes had just passed since the two of them sat there in complete silence. How they missed being at the cabin with the rest of the group, safe and sound. Why did Carver have to return? Why couldn't he have just let them alone? In the middle of the Walker apocalypse where humans should be working together to survive, instead they fought against each other. If it weren't for Carver, then maybe none of this would have happened. Clementine was glad Lee killed him when he did. Before long, the two started when something was banging against the glass from outside. A single walker was trying to get them. He was soon able to break down the glass on his own and collapse onto his stomach. Slowly lifting his head towards his victims, the walker stood up and slowly limped towards them. Clementine took out her Glock 17 as Sarah stood behind her with AJ. She closed one eye and was about to pull the trigger on him. Clementine's expression changed when she lowered her weapon down, no longer needing to waste a bullet. The walker, seeing it from behind, was killed and collapsed down onto the ground. Clementine dropped her gun down, with her expression was full of different emotions. Happy, relieved, shocked, and sad. She could only watch in shock as her guardian stood before her. Lee panted, was it trying to catch his breath back. His entire body was covered in Walker blood and guts, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he looked exhausted, and rather like he was at the verge of passing out. He had a duffel bag strapped onto his back, which may explain to part of his reason for being so tired. Without saying both, Clem and Sarah ran towards Lee, who knelt down towards them both, wrapped his arms around them in a tight embrace as two girls returned. He kept his promise to Clementine. "Lee," Clementine whispered, tears of happiness falling out from her eyes like waterfalls. "You're alive!" "I told you I would come back, didn't I?" Lee replied, with a slight grin across his face, but nevertheless he was grateful to have them back with him. He had to let them go when it was time before it got dark again. "We better get back to the truck." "What about the horde?" Clementine asked, taking her head away from Lee's chest and that left blood smeared on her face. "Don't worry about them, Clementine," Lee assured her as they stood up to the height and proceeded to walk over to the next area of Let's Go. With the four of them reunited and most of them lost the horde and spread out in numbers, it was time to continue their journey to Wellington, where they can get away from this once and for all.